Over the past 4 weeks or so, 5 weeks maybe, we have been looking at the book of Daniel, beginning with chapter one, and what we saw was that in chapter one we get a background to what is going on. Daniel and his friends are taken to Babylon, and they prove to be faithful in standing for God's principles. They will not eat the king's meat, and God blesses them in a special way for this. They end up having more wisdom than anybody else in Babylon, and God gives Daniel special understanding of dreams and visions. Then the king has a vision of a great image, and of course the king doesn't remember what the dream is, can't interpret it. Daniel eventually interprets the dream, and in his dream he saw a stone smiting the image on the feet. The stone became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So Daniel's interpretation of the vision was that the head of this image, which was made of gold, represented the kingdom of Babylon. We understand it represented Babylon. History tells us this. Daniel simply said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "You are this head of gold." And we understand he was talking about Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. The next part of the image was made of silver. It represented the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, which followed Babylon. The next part of the image was made of brass, the belly and the thighs. It represented the kingdom of the Greeks, which followed the Medo-Persians. The next part of the image was the legs. It was made of iron, and it represented the iron kingdom of Rome, which came after Greece. And finally, we had the feet made partly of iron, partly of clay, and it represented the same Rome divided up into little pieces. So it is during the time of the it's during the time of divided Rome, those kingdoms at the bottom, the iron and the clay, that the stone is cut out, that smites the image and becomes a great mountain. That was Daniel chapter 2. In Daniel chapter 3, we saw that Nebuchadnezzar made an image completely of gold from head to foot. And we understand what he was trying to do was to suggest that his kingdom would never pass away. His kingdom would last forever. And he commanded everybody to worship this image. We see that there were the three Hebrew young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel's friends who would not bow to the image. The king threw them into a burning fiery furnace. God supernaturally preserved them by sending an angel to save them in the fire. And we find that Nebuchadnezzar is beginning to be respectful of the God of the Hebrews. He's learning that this God is an extraordinary person who is able to save. And I didn't put this in, but last week we saw that Nebuchadnezzar, God worked with him in a special way to teach him to respect the God of heaven. He made him mad for 7 years until he learned that God is the one who rules. What we find is that Nebuchadnezzar ended up praising the God of heaven. Now, that brings us to chapter 5, which is what we want to look at this week. And in Daniel chapter 5, we find that historically, we're about to move from the kingdom of Babylon to the next kingdom. Remember the image, the head was gold, what the gold was to pass away. It was to be replaced by the silver kingdom, which was Medo-Persia. That's what Nebuchadnezzar saw in his vision, and that's how Daniel interpreted it. So right in the book of Daniel here, we have the story of when that change took place. Yeah, Brother Keep, go ahead.
Yeah. So Nebuchadnezzar in that 7 years, do you think that could be alluding to 7 years of tribulation? Could it be what people are looking at as a 7 year tribulation? Or I believe we're on the lines of 3.5 years, but uh, what do you think about that?
I mean, it's an interesting idea. Um, I'm cautious. I'm very cautious because it's not a prophecy. There are some chapters that are not prophecies. They are types, or they are, yeah, you could say they are types. But in types, when you're dealing with types, the time periods are very vague and generalized. They are not so specific. Now, if it's a prophecy, then the time periods are very specific. But like I say, a type is like a parable. It's an illustration, so the specifics are not so detailed. That's why I'm cautious. I know that there are people who follow that kind of thinking and they end up with ideas that I consider to be unsound, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, I think. Yeah, the Jehovah's Witnesses believe that those 7 years that Nebuchadnezzar was mad, it's a prophecy. And they believe that, so they make a day for a year. And so I think it's the Jehovah's Witnesses. I know that there's a set of people um, also among Adventists, breakaways, who believe that those 7 times represented 2,250 years, I think it works out to. They say 7 sevens, so they multiply 7 years, they multiply 1 year by 360, multiplied by 7. Yeah, 360 multiplied by 7, and they end up with 2250. So they say there's a prophecy that covers 2,250 years, and they started way back in the time of the way back in the time of Babylon. So I'm just saying that I'm a little cautious of doing something like that, because if we apply literal times in this way, we have to have a good reason for doing it. Why do we operate? Why do we come to this conclusion? So that's just what I'm saying, Brother Kip. All right. So we are in Daniel chapter 5, and it says, Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. So the first thing I want to comment on is that this Belshazzar, who was he? Because in chapter 4, we saw Nebuchadnezzar becoming mad for 7 years and then being restored to his kingdom. Now, chapter 5, it talks about somebody named Belshazzar. From what I have read, I believe Belshazzar was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had a son, I think his name was Nabopolassar. You can read about him in the Bible. And then after that, he died, and the kingdom passed to his son Belshazzar. So the sequence would be Nebuchadnezzar, Nabopolassar, and then Belshazzar. Nothing happened of significance during the time of Nabopolassar, apparently, so Daniel's book does not contain any history of Nabopolassar. So chapter 5 just jumps right across to the time of Belshazzar. And what we can make of this is we can conclude that the book of Daniel is not a history book. God never told Daniel to write a history book, otherwise he would have written about Nabopolassar and those intervening years. That's how history works. But Daniel is not a book of history. Daniel is a book of God's interactions. It's important to remember this. That is why you can look at chapter 3 and you see God saving them from the burning fiery furnace. You can look at chapter 4 and you can see God stepping into the life of Nebuchadnezzar in order to save him. So every chapter in the book of Daniel is a book about God's intervention. Chapter 6 is about Daniel being saved from the den of lions. So the point I'm making is that these stories in the book of Daniel are not just there for historical value. That's why it's good for us to look at them closely, because they are intended to help us to discern more perfectly the way that God works among men. So you get the point. So the whole book of Daniel is important, although there are some parts that are prophetic, but even the non-prophetic parts are also designed by God to reveal important truth. So we find ourselves in the time of Belshazzar, and he's making a great feast to thousands of his lords, and he's drinking wine. Now, I've heard speculation as to which feast this was. I've heard it said that this was the Feast of Tammuz. I don't know, it quite possibly it could be. It certainly was a feast dedicated to the pagan gods that Belshazzar and probably the rest of Babylon worshipped. It was a feast like this. It wasn't just that they were getting together to eat food. They were eating food on a special occasion. And we can see that as we continue to read. So, no, not this. So, it says in verse 2, Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines might drink therein. There is a secular saying that goes something like this. I think it's a Greek saying. Whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad. It's some philosophical saying, I think by some Greek person or some person from the distant past. But it's true. It's a true commentary on how things work, because you wonder why somebody in his right sense, Belshazzar, why would he in his right sense set out to sow dishonor and blaspheme the God of the Hebrews? What is interesting, we have seen week after week that a lot of these people in ancient times, they believed in multiple gods. And they had their gods, and they believed that another nation had a different set of gods. They believed in different gods. But the thing about Belshazzar, he was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and he knew the history of Nebuchadnezzar. So he had a lot of reason to respect the God of the Hebrews. So what he was doing is kind of inexplicable. So he sends for the sacred vessels that came from the temple in Jerusalem, knowing that these belong to the worship of Jehovah, the Hebrew God, the one that his grandfather had learned to fear and respect, and now he decides that he's going to disrespect this God. What gets into somebody why he does something like this? You see people do crazy things and you wonder what gets into them to do this. Why doesn't he just drink out of his normal vessels and keep himself quiet? But no, he sets out to blaspheme the name of Jehovah and to deface the vessels that were used. Yes, Brother Ian, go ahead. Ian? Ian, if you're speaking, you're muted. Okay, I'm going to assume that hand is accidentally put up.
No, I just didn't hear you. You faded out on my side.
Ah,
Okay, I assume you're talking about my app. Okay, I'm just wondering if Nebuchadnezzar had adopted his grandson, seeing that his son died and left him as a child, if he adopted him as his own son, because later in the chapter it speaks about him, Nebuchadnezzar as his father. I know that sometimes this happens. I know people who have adopted their own grandchildren as their own children.
Well, I'm basing what I said on maybe what I've read in the past. I haven't read it recently, but what I've read in the past suggests that he was Nebuchadnezzar's own son. I don't think it's likely that Nebuchadnezzar had only one son, because in those days kings had multiple wives. So maybe this was another.
Oh, I thought you said earlier that the he had another son, and then this was that I must have misunderstood you, because I've heard it
Yeah,
so many people that they said that Belshazzar was his grandson.
right. I guess you misunderstood me because I didn't say that.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So it says in verse 3, then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem. And the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine from the vessels dedicated to the worship of God. Let me add that part. They drank wine from the vessels dedicated to the worship of Jehovah. And they praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. So what we can see here is that this is a deliberate and barefaced effort to make a mockery of God. It's not like there was somebody who was ignorant and he decided to do this. He not only, he chooses to send for the vessels that were taken from the house of Yahweh. And then he decides to drink from these vessels, and that was bad enough. But while he's doing it now, he's praising the gods of silver and of gold and of wood and of stone. So this is deliberate and barefaced attack against Jehovah. And that's why I'm saying, I'm quoting the phrase, whom the gods would destroy, they first make them mad. Because surely you know what this God did in the days of your grandfather. You know that he spared the Hebrew children from the fiery furnace. He made your grandfather mad for 7 years. Surely Belshazzar would have known all of this. And yet he chooses to go and defy this God. Why does he do this? Well, I tell you, when a man is drunk, he does a lot of stupid things. Those who have ever been drunk or who have ever seen drunk people, you know that they behave like fools. When I was a teenager, and I used to use a little bit of marijuana, weed, ganja. When I smoked, I got this feeling. I felt like I could step out into the road and stand in the street, and if a car smashed into me, it would just wrap around me. That was the kind of feeling I had. My mind gave me distorted perspectives of reality. And the same thing happened when you are drunk, maybe not in the same exact way, but Nebuchadnezzar must have been, not Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar must have been drunk, and so he's behaving like a fool. Now, when you do something like this, I'm going to testify that maybe far in the back of your mind, but somewhere there's a little uneasiness. There's some uneasiness. Whenever you're doing something that is wrong, there's uneasiness. And when you're doing something stupid and wrong, there is double uneasiness. You feel it and you know that something is wrong. And because you're uneasy, you tend to be jumpy, right? And so I'm saying all of this to highlight what happened next. Because it says in verses 5 and 6, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. Yeah, I used to find it really amusing when you watch a movie or something and you see somebody's knees beginning to knock. I mean, I've seen it in real life, but in real life your knees don't knock in an exaggerated way. But Belshazzar was obviously scared out of his wits because he sees a hand. I don't know if I should tell a little story. It's kind of irrelevant. I probably won't tell it. But Belshazzar, out of nowhere, he's drinking and his brain is befuddled by liquor. But he's still able to see, and out of the corner of his eyes, he glances and sees something happening on the wall. When he looks, he sees a hand. There's a hand without a body, and the hand is writing. And Belshazzar is scared out of his wits. His knees begin to knock against one another. It's so obvious that the writer of the book of Daniel takes notice of those knocking knees. And the reason why he's so frightened, I mean, normally, yeah, he's sobered up quickly. Normally when you have something like this happening, when somebody is uncomfortable in the back of their minds and something like this happens, they know instinctively that it's not good news. And Belshazzar kind of understood that. But it's not just that, it's that in the presence of some supernatural being, he's scared to death. When you look at what happens in the next verse, I'll comment on it afterwards. It says, then the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. Why? Because that's the way things run in the kingdom of Babylon at this point in time. And somebody may say, well, didn't Nebuchadnezzar learn that these men had no power and no authority? Nebuchadnezzar's experience was his experience, right? It's like in Jamaica, the culture out there in the world is that most people go for what they call dancehall music. It's the most disgusting and distasteful kind of music, in my opinion. But most of the society, they go for dancehall music, right? That kind of music. And if I live in a family where all of us go for that kind of music and we live that lifestyle, and then I choose to follow God, and I make them know that that kind of thing is bad, and I give up, I won't be doing that anymore. When I die, my family still continues to follow up their dancehall music. In other words, the change that takes place in me, it doesn't change the culture, right? If they don't find their own experience with God, they'll just keep on living the same lifestyle that they were living, that I used to live as well. And I'm just saying this to explain why it is that Nebuchadnezzar could have had such a thoroughly humbling experience. And his grandson comes along, and he doesn't care one bit about what happened to his grandfather. He's doing the same thing that Nebuchadnezzar did in the days of his blindness. The reason is because that's the way life is, that's the way culture works. So Belshazzar comes up, he grows up in Babylon, he sees Babylon everywhere, he sees the way they behave in Babylon, and he just falls into line with it. The experience of Nebuchadnezzar, his grandfather, makes little impact on him. That's the way life operates. It's not really strange when you think about it. So he sends for the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers, because that is how it works in the kingdom of Babylon. It says, and the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. All right, starting at the end, I wonder why he says he would be the third ruler. I'm not sure. Um, I think I don't want to mislead you. I think I read that Belshazzar is reigning jointly with somebody else at this point, maybe his father. I think that's what I read some time ago, but I'm mentioning it without putting it in stone because I need to go back and refresh my memory. But I think that's why he says Daniel will be the third ruler in the kingdom, because there are two kings already, probably Belshazzar's father and then Belshazzar. So he wanted to make Daniel number 3. It's kind of interesting too to see that there's a difference between Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar. In Nebuchadnezzar's day, he would have said, any of you who can't interpret it, I'm going to chop you in pieces and turn your house into a dunghill. Belshazzar is more, he's not threatening, he's offering rewards. Anybody who can read this writing, show me the interpretation. I'll give him clothing of scarlet, the color of royalty. And I'll put a chain around his neck, and he shall become the third ruler in the kingdom. So he's offering bribes where Nebuchadnezzar offered threats. So Nebuchadnezzar, you would say he was a stronger man, a stronger dictator. He ruled with a firmer hand. Maybe you could say that this suggests that. And so one of the reason why I bring that up is because one of the principles we can learn as we look at these kingdoms, and I see your hand, Ayan, and I'm taking note of a point that Sister Jema made. She says that according to history, he was ruling jointly with somebody else, but that person was in another part of the kingdom and some other business, probably his father, and that is why he was the one in charge. But one thing we can know as we look at the record of history, the people who led out in the conquest of nations were strong. Like Nebuchadnezzar was a very strong king. His kingdom was taken over by Cyrus. Cyrus was a strong king. Cyrus's kingdom, Medo-Persia, was taken over by Greece, and the leader of Greece was Alexander the Great. And I think when Rome came to prominence, it was led by Julius Caesar, another strong king. At the beginning of these kingdoms, they have strong leaders. But by the time they fall, they have weak leaders. They have leaders who, the country has become watered down, weak, and the leaders are weak. Okay? So this is why I'm making the point that Nebuchadnezzar was strong, but Belshazzar was weak. If Belshazzar had been strong like his father Nebuchadnezzar, the kingdom would have put up a stronger fight against the Medo-Persians, might not have been overthrown. Anyway, go ahead, Brother Ian.
Yeah, so you come back to the point I was raising earlier. The Bible speaks about to Belteshazzar. I mean, even the queen said that your father, and referred to Nebuchadnezzar as his father. So now where I'm hearing that he has another father, which was somewhere else in another kingdom, or he was ruling along with his father. So I'm saying that more than likely Nebuchadnezzar must have adopted him as his son, because how was the scripture, was the writing saying, referring to Nebuchadnezzar as Belteshazzar's father?
Okay. The thing is that the Bible does this all the time. When it speaks of Jesus, it says he will sit on the throne of his father, David. All of David's descendants refer to David as their father. Paul says, what shall we say that Abraham, our father, has obtained? So it's a popular device in the Bible that everybody's descendant is called his son, and they refer to their grandfather. Usually they might highlight an outstanding person in their history, and they refer to that person as their father because they're making the connection with that person. So that's all I understand is happening here when it says Nebuchadnezzar, your father. It goes on now in verse 8. It says, then came in all the king's wise men. Same story over and over. It happens so many times. Happened in Daniel chapter 2, happens in Daniel chapter 4, and now it's happening again in chapter 8. It says, then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Now it's interesting, they could not read the writing and they could not make the interpretation known. So I believe it is some language. I believe so, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. I believe it's a particular language, but I'm not sure which language. It might be Hebrew, I'm not sure. But anyway, it says they can't read the writing, much more to give the interpretation. So I understand that when it says they can't read the writing, I understand, I mean, obviously it's written in a language or maybe in a kind of script that they are not familiar with. So they can't even tell what it is saying, much more the interpretation. This is an artist impression, I'm not sure. I think the artist probably put in some Hebrew type of writing there. But it's some kind of script. Belshazzar didn't recognize it, and the wise men of Babylon didn't recognize it. So they were not able to read it, nor to interpret it. It says, then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled. I think that by this time Nebuchadnezzar might have been threatening to cut people in pieces. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. So his face grew pale, and everybody was in a kind of quandary. They recognized what most of us recognize, and what we should not forget. When God gives a message, it is intended to be understood. Okay, if somebody says they get a message from God and they don't understand it, and nobody understands it, I tend to believe you didn't get a message from God, right? Well, possibly sometime in the future, somebody might understand it, maybe, if it's recorded, but I know that when God gives a message, it is intended to be understood. And there's always a lesson. There's always a lesson to be learned when God gives a message. So, I mean, I say this because I know that in Jamaica, sometimes you have some women, they wrap their heads and they will go and stand at a spot and they dress up in strange clothing, sometimes men too, and they will mark X at the spot right in the road, and they will shout and say, crosses are murder or something, and they will make some dire prediction. And you know, there's a fellow in Jamaica who claim to be some kind of prophet, and every year, I think his name is Terry, every year they publish in the paper a list of predictions that he makes. And well, not every year, but quite a number of years. I don't know if it's every year because I don't take the time to look and see if it's there every year. But what he normally will do is tell you who will win the next election. He will tell you things like that. He'll tell you how many people will die or so. He gives you some information that is no help to anybody. Completely irrelevant. The only thing it does is to make you think, man, this guy is some kind of prophet. And whenever this kind of information comes, we know it doesn't come from God. Anytime God sends a message, it is to be understood, and it is to be understood in some way that will benefit somebody. So Belshazzar understands this. You don't see something like that and it doesn't have a meaning. You don't see a handwriting on the wall. If I were to see a handwriting on the wall of my office, oh my goodness, Nothing would stop me from searching night and day to find the reason. What is that hand saying? I would go down in fasting and prayer. I would have to know what it means, because it means that God is sending a message. So the king is extremely perplexed, and also the people who are there with him. And what makes it worse is that the king recognizes that he was doing something that was out of order. He was drinking from the vessels that belong to the God Jehovah, and he was honoring the gods of wood and stone. So he's very disturbed, and he wants to know the answer. It says in verse 10, now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. And the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. Now I'm going to say a little bit more about something else. Now I did say earlier on that I think Belshazzar's father was somebody named Nabopolassar. Now I think the historical records say his father was somebody named Nabonidus. Nabonidus. I think Sister Jane and some other people were posting that in the chat. If I recall correctly, and I'm saying again, I didn't look at it recently. I'm trying to recall what I read. I read that it is believed by historians that Nabonidus was the same person who was called Nabopolassar, because in the Bible we have a record of a Babylonian king named Nabopolassar. I don't think there's a record of somebody named Nabonidus. So what they suggested was that, let me see if I'm right, Nabonidus. What they suggested, no, right. What they suggested is that the name Nabopolassar is the same person who history recognizes as Nabonidus. So it's the same person, but in the Bible, he has a different name. And it could be understood by the fact that even Daniel, Daniel is one name that he's given in a Hebrew name, and he's also called Belteshazzar by Nebuchadnezzar, or even Solomon. Solomon was called Solomon, but he was also called Jedidiah. Jedidiah. So if you read about Jedidiah in the Bible, you wonder who it is. It's actually Solomon. So anyway, that's just an explanation I wanted to touch on there. Now, I mentioned that because as we talk about the queen here, we might think that this is speaking of Belshazzar's wife. But it's also suggested that this queen here is not Belshazzar's wife, it's Belshazzar's mother. This queen apparently is somebody who has some connection with the past many years. Belshazzar is one of those young fellows, and he has surrounded himself with young people who apparently don't have much sense because they were in full agreement with him in what he was doing. This woman knew the history of the kingdom and understood a little bit. So she says, it says, now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. This lady hears that something is going on. And another reason why I don't think it's Belshazzar's wife, because if you look what it says that the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines might drink therein. So his wives were there, and so were his concubines. So this queen is clearly not the wife of Belshazzar. So this queen here, it is believed, was his mother. We would say today the queen mother, right? And she tells Belshazzar, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. She's saying, be at peace and let your mind be at rest. She's saying, I have a solution to the problem. There is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar thy father, the king I say thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers, for as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubts, were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. So, this is a woman who clearly has a lot of knowledge of Daniel, and she knows all the details of his past. You know, when I think about it, it seems obvious that this lady, she admires Daniel, the way she describes him. She's a fan of Daniel. What is also interesting is how it seems that from the time that Nebuchadnezzar died, Daniel kind of went into obscurity for some reason. I mean, he lost his name and lost his place. And it brings the knowledge home to us. It makes us aware of this, that tradition and culture and custom are stronger than even personal affection. Nebuchadnezzar respected and honored and loved Daniel. What do you think happened when Nebuchadnezzar died? When Nebuchadnezzar died, and the next king that came, he dealt with people of Babylon. He wasn't going to deal with any outsider and any stranger, right? So he moved Daniel out of the way, and he restored parity. The people who came back to power were Babylonians. And I'm sure that even in Egypt, in Babylon here, and in Medo-Persia, we are going to see, there was some kind of subliminal resentment. The people who were there, they resented the idea that somebody from outside, a stranger, came in and got all the honor. So what it seems like is that after Nebuchadnezzar died, Daniel was shunted into the background. And so this can explain why nobody seems to know about Daniel except this old woman. She comes now. She's apparently an older woman, and she remembers everything. Now, if you admire Daniel, you would never forget. Who would know better than this lady of the value that Daniel had to the kingdom, because she's from the old school. She's from the previous generation. So she knows how valuable Daniel was, and she is one of those who were maybe in the background admiring Daniel, because look at the way she speaks of him. There's an excellent spirit, knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, showing of hard sentences. He could explain hard riddles and so forth. Dissolving of doubts. She has a glowing resume to give of Daniel. These were found in that same Daniel. And then she ends by saying confidently, she's not even asking Daniel, now let Daniel be called and he will show the interpretation. My goodness, what confidence. But that's the kind of reputation that God had put on this Daniel. It says, then was Daniel brought in before the king. And the king spake and said unto Daniel, art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? Now, isn't it so interesting that the man does not even know Daniel? It's interesting. They have pushed Daniel into the background so much that the man who was so prominent in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, they don't even know, the king does not even know Daniel. Anyway, he continues. I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that the light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. All right, I think by the time he died, Nebuchadnezzar had passed this place where he said that the spirit of the gods is in you. I think by the time he died, Nebuchadnezzar would have said, the spirit of the holy God, the Most High. Remember, that's the title Nebuchadnezzar gave God. Last week we saw that. Nebuchadnezzar would have said, the spirit of the Most High is in you. But Belshazzar has gone so far back into darkness. Ignorance has so befuddled his mind over the years that he says, the spirit of the gods is in thee. He has gone back to the same level of darkness and ignorance that Nebuchadnezzar had descended to. But he goes on anyway, he's carrying on. He's saying, and now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read the writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now the first, yes.
It's obvious based on what he said in a few verses back up. He was able to identify, to tell exactly where Daniel came from and how he came about. So he knew about Daniel, although he didn't know him in person. Because the queen didn't tell him anything about the background of Daniel. She just said that there was a man in whom the spirit of the God of God is. But he's now saying, are you that Daniel that came out of Jewry and so forth and so forth. He's saying things that historically probably he heard about.
Right, his memory is stirring him up and he's now making some connections. Must have heard about him somewhere. And I think later on Daniel says something that kind of verifies that it is so. But I'll comment on that when I come to that. Something that Daniel says later on. Now, it's very interesting to me that, you know, they look at Nebuchadnezzar's offering to make Daniel the third ruler in the kingdom.
You mean Belshazzar?
Belshazzar. This highlights the fact that Belshazzar is aware that this message is of preeminent importance. You don't offer to give away a third of your authority or to give somebody that kind of authority in your kingdom unless it's like almost a matter of life and death. So he knows. And I suppose if you saw a handwriting on the wall, you would feel that way as well. But it's very important to him. And his way of getting things done is to bribe people or to reward people. You can see from the fact that he's offering to give Daniel these riches, these benefits. That's the way he's accustomed to doing things. I mean, if he had just asked Daniel, Daniel would have told him that what he had, given him what he had. But he believes that that there's something that he needs to offer. Now, in verse 17, Daniel answers him like how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered Nebuchadnezzar. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself. You know what he's saying? Keep your gifts to yourself and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king and make known to him the interpretation. I mean, I appreciate and admire somebody who gets to the place of Daniel. I mean, Daniel is an old man by now because he has gone through the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. He died. He went through the reign of his son Nabonidus. He's there, but now his son Belshazzar. Daniel has lived long enough to be forgotten. doesn't want money. What is he going to do with money? And what can they give him in Babylon to make him happier than where he is? Probably living in his own little cottage somewhere. He doesn't want money and he doesn't want honor. Right? So he says, it's okay.
Brother David, I think it's more than that. I think he has an attitude towards this king different from what he had to Nebuchadnezzar. Because Nebuchadnezzar gave him the same offer, and he never refused it when he told him the dream in chapter 2. But this man is basically, throwing back this thing back in his face, because he apparently doesn't really care much for what he wants from him. I think he has a different attitude to this. I'm picking that up, that he has a different attitude to this king than he had with his grandfather. I don't know if you see that.
I noticed that. I don't think Nebuchadnezzar offered Daniel anything.
Yeah, he did say that he'll make him second ruler in the kingdom.
After Daniel gave him the interpretation.
Oh, after. Okay, yeah.
When it was over, he said he made him the second ruler in the kingdom. But he never bribed him at the beginning. He just asked him, and Daniel told him, and then he gave him that. But Belshazzar is trying to offer him something at the beginning, as though he needs the bribe in order to answer the question. And so I mean, in a way, it's a little bit of disrespect to Daniel. It's like Daniel is prostituting the gift that God gave him, and I can understand why. It's like you remember Elisha, when he healed Naaman, and Naaman offered to give him riches and so forth, and Elisha said, no, what I have is not for sale. Basically, that's what Elisha said. That is why when Gehazi ran him down and told him to send something, Elisha had changed his mind. God struck him with leprosy because he had prostituted. He prostituted the gift that God gave Elisha. It's kind of similar to where Simon Magus came to Peter and offered him money. If Peter could give him the gift of healing, and Peter said, your money perish with you, that you thought that the gift of God could be purchased with money. So I think it's a kind of similar principle that Belshazzar is trying to do. He's offering riches in return for the benefit that comes from God's gift. And I think that's one of the reasons, or probably the main reason, why Daniel says, keep your money. I don't need money to do this. This is not something God gave me to offer for sale. So he says, keep your money to yourself and give your gifts to somebody else. I don't need it. So, but I'll tell you anyway. Now he begins, just like he begins with Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel is not afraid to tell the truth. With Nebuchadnezzar, he says, you were lying on your bed and you were thinking a certain thing. And when Nebuchadnezzar had that dream about the tree, Daniel didn't answer him right away. Daniel says, then when Daniel began to answer, Daniel said, King, I hope that this thing might be fulfilled on your enemies. He's telling everything. He's not just giving the interpretation. And so he does the same thing with Belshazzar. He says, O king, O thou king, the Most High God, he gives God the right title. The Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and a majesty and glory and honor. Again, he's acknowledging that everything comes from God. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he slew, and whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he put down, he set up, and whom he would he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. He's rehearsing what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He's reviewing it and opening it up before Belshazzar, something that he knows very well. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses, wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointed over it whomsoever he will. Now, this is why I'm saying that Belshazzar had knowledge of this, because Daniel says, And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. So it is clear that he had knowledge of the history of what had happened to his father Nebuchadnezzar. He knew that Nebuchadnezzar had been made mad for 7 years, and he knew the reason for it. You know, if you look at the annals of history, you might, a Jamaican prime minister by the name of Donald Sangster, he remained in office for 1 month and then he died. They say he had some brain problem, I don't know. But all of us in Jamaica, probably if we did a little Jamaican history, you know about this man. He died, he was in the shortest reigning prime minister, 1 month. But the details of why he died, what happened, are not so well known. I don't even know it myself, but I'm just using an example. I'm saying that the details, what happened, what killed him exactly. So those are the details that are not known. But Belshazzar knew not only that his grandfather was out of office for 7 years. He knew why he was out of office, and he knew what happened. He knew that the Most High God, he knew that according to the story, according to the record, Nebuchadnezzar was made mad. He knew before he got mad that he was going to be mad. So that record was a matter of public record. He knew that at the end of 7 years, just as was prophesied, his grandfather came back to his senses. So it was not a secret. At least by the time you came to that third generation, it was still very public knowledge. So when Daniel says to Belshazzar, you knew this, he's speaking something that is a matter of public knowledge. And he says, even though you know this, you have not humbled your heart. In other words, you are defying the Most High God. Based on what happened to your grandfather, you knew that he's the Most High, but you have no respect for him. So you bet Belshazzar has an idea of what is going on with where that hand came from. But thou hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven. Again, you have to notice these descriptive words. The Lord of heaven. Belshazzar says, the spirit of the gods. Daniel says, you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, the ruler of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of the house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver, gold, brass, wood, iron, stone, which see not, neither hear nor know. And here's the crowning blasphemy. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, thou hast not glorified. Now, when Nebuchadnezzar did this, God overlooked it because he was in ignorance. When he glorified himself and prowled through his palace in Babylon and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built? And when he destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and took away the vessels and carried them to Babylon and put them in the house of his God, all of those things God overlooked because they were done by a man in great ignorance. Belshazzar's blasphemy is not ignorance. It is defiance. And this is the reason why God sent him this message.
That's why I think Daniel didn't respect him that much.
That is most likely true as well. It says, then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. This is the writing that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. So Daniel is able to read that writing. Whatever language it was, Daniel is familiar with it. It's in a kind of language that even the learned men of Babylon can't recognize the writing. So I think it may be unlikely that it is Hebrew. I don't know. I'm not saying it isn't, right? I'm just saying if it's Hebrew, I'm just wondering why none of them could read it. Because surely some of them were learned enough to be multilingual. Maybe not. But anyway, Daniel can read it. And Daniel reads it as saying, literally it says, mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Then Daniel begins to interpret it, and his interpretation is a little different, if you notice. This is the interpretation of the thing. Many. It means numbered. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Point number one. Tekel, or tekel. Thou art weighed in the balances, weighed, and art found wanting. Now the third word is upharsin, but Daniel refers to it as Perez. And apparently upharsin is a form of the word Perez. Upharsin is a form of the same word. That's what I'm concluding. So upharsin or Perez is referring to the Medes and the Persians. So Daniel sees numbered, weighed, Persians are Medes and Persians, and he interprets it. And he says, this is what it means. Your kingdom has been numbered and finished. You are weighed in the balances and you are found wanting. And so your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. All right? So balances are scales for weighing, for measuring, for assessing. And so this is what Daniel is saying. I'll just read to the end of the chapter, and then we'll come back and look at this in a little bit more detail. It says, then commanded Belshazzar. He goes ahead with his plan anyway. And they clothed Daniel with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. All right? They give him the reward regardless of whether he wants it or not. But it goes on to say, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. That is the night when his kingdom was overthrown. So God gave him the message right at the last moment. But you see, here's what I think. Let me just read the last verse and tell you what I think. And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. What I think and what is obvious is that the decay of Babylon was something that had been happening progressively over years. It didn't happen that night. What Belshazzar did in bringing the vessels out of the house of God was simply the crowning act of blasphemy. Somebody doesn't get up and do that overnight without previously demonstrating a direction to their lives. So in the conflict between Rome and between Babylon and the Medes and the Persians, in that conflict, the Medes and the Persians were getting stronger and Babylon was getting weaker. Babylon was in a state of decay. It was going downhill. And whenever somebody is unmuted, whenever a global power, an empire, a great empire begins to degenerate, it is because the fundamental principles that made it strong are changing. Okay, and you can look at all the great nations of today. You can look at America, you can look at the European Union, you can look at England, that used to be called Great Britain, and you can see all of them degenerated and went down to a state of weakness. America is still strong. It's headed in a certain direction. We will see. But the point is, Babylon was in that state of decline. And it had to do also, part of it had to do with the attitude of the king and the way that the nation had become blasphemous in their attitude towards the God of heaven. This final event shows you that that's a part of it. Okay? So, by the time Belshazzar got this vision or saw this event, it was more than a vision. Everybody saw it. It was a literal event. By the time he saw this event, it was already too late. It was already too late. It was a final sentence. that God gave to him as a culmination of all his behavior over the years. So that night he was killed, and I'm going to say a little bit about that in a moment. Now, what we know is that that night the Medes and the Persians conquered Babylon. Now, I'm going to remind us of how it happened. I want us to make a good note of what happened, why it happened, and how it happened, because when you come to the book of Revelation, something happens that is very similar, and we can understand it better if we understand what happened, how Babylon was overthrown. Now, the Medes and the Persians were encamped against Babylon. Now, if you look at this
Before you go on, can I just say something regarding what you said previously?
Okay, go ahead.
In terms of the degradation or of the kingdom, I think it is significant that the king, who was supposed to be the number one ruler in the kingdom, had gone away to live outside of the kingdom, outside of the capital for so long. Obviously, something must have not been right there. Why the king is living somewhere else, and history seems to show that he was living at another place. You know, if you have a king that is running in a place as big as Babylon, and he chooses to go live somewhere else in another country, it shows that something is not too right with the strength and power of that kingdom.
Yeah, I suppose it could have been said that he was there on state business or official business. You know, yeah, I suppose somebody might say that, but yeah.
History, according to the history book, it said that he was there for a long period of time.
Sure, possible. Yeah. Just look at this illustration here, which is an illustration, and it's an imaginary illustration. But right along here, where you have the walls of Babylon, it is said that these walls were so thick that 2 chariots could pass side by side on the top of the walls. The walls were that thick, and the walls were so tall that I forget the exact height, but it was very tall. Nobody could scale those walls, and you couldn't break it down because it was so thick. It was a magnificent, in terms of the ancient world, it was a magnificent place, very secure. Now, normally, one of the things they would do in those days is to besiege a city. They would surround it completely, an enemy army, and they would starve the people. Now, in Babylon, they would laugh at you because the river Euphrates, which was a major, massive river, ran under the walls of Babylon, ran right through Babylon and came out on the other side. So they had an unending water supply. They could plant their crops inside of the city. They had areas where they could plant, and if an army surrounded them and laid siege to the city, they could simply relax and let the army stay there as long as they wanted. Babylon was considered a very secure place by the standards of those days. Now, they had a double security, and I hope you can see my illustration, because here is the channel of the, hope you can see my illustration. Here's the river running through Babylon. Now, they had built it in such a way that the river ran in a straight line right through the city. It came under the wall at one place, it exited on the other side. So if somebody was thinking, well, maybe they could get into boats or they could swim under the walls of the river, and then they would be in the city. But the other thing is, even when you got into the channel of the river, if you were able to get in, if you notice, the river has these things here that you see here that represent bridges. These are bridges that cross the river. So if there are bridges, you have to have roads that cross from one side to the other of the city. But where the bridges entered the city, you had another wall. You had another wall on each side of the river. You had walls. So you could get into the river bed and walk right through the city from one end to the other, and you still couldn't get into the city because of these walls. But where you had these bridges going across, where in the walls they had gates. That's some gates here. That's some gates here. Every place that they had these bridges crossing over the river, they had to have gates so people could travel from one side of the city over to the other side. Right? You had these gates here. So you could travel from the right side over here, over to the left side, cross over the river. Now, on the night, every night, they would close these gates. These gates where you could enter the different sides of the city, where the bridges crossed over the river. Every night, those gates would be closed. So during the night, the left side of the city was cut off from the right side of the city. But on the night in question, they did not close the gates. And why do you think they probably didn't close the gates? Because they were having this great feast. It was a night of feasting, and they were so sure that they were okay. They were so sure that Babylon was impregnable. The river was running under the city. They never knew that those Medo-Persians would come up with such a devilish plan. The Medo-Persians blocked up the river. Now, maybe they couldn't block it up entirely, because you can't shut off a river completely like that. But they found enough debris and enough stuff to divert the course temporarily so that the river began to run in another direction. Even if a trickle still came through, it wasn't enough to stop them. So they were able to go under the walls of Babylon, through the riverbed, and when they got into the city, there were these walls on either side. But guess what? That night the gates were not shut. The gates were open that night. Everybody was so busy having this feast, which some believe was a feast of Tammuz. I don't know. But they were having this feast, and so they were careless. And so the Babylonians came in, and the Medo-Persians came into Babylon, and you could almost say they found a welcome mat. The door was open. It's like the Babylonians were saying, "Come on in and do as you please." And that's what exactly they did. They came in and they overthrew. Everybody was in the middle of carousing. Nobody was ready for battle. And so they killed Belshazzar that night. Now, I don't want to avoid one of the most important things about this experience of Belshazzar. And I know we have commented on this many times, but I'm going to go back to it. Belshazzar, the story of Belshazzar teaches us that before God overthrows one kingdom, remember, we have seen several times in the book of Daniel that God is the one who rules and gives the kingdom to anybody he chooses. But as we have pointed out before, God does not do this arbitrarily. God is acting with some people, some angels who are referred to as watchers. Nebuchadnezzar heard them mentioned, the watchers, holy ones. And these are beings in heaven who are helping to make these decisions, who are taking part in some kind of judgment where God, or where heaven examines each kingdom before they are rejected and the next one comes on the scene. And we see it very clearly here in Belshazzar's case. God said to Belshazzar that your kingdom has been numbered. And numbering is a form of making an assessment. You give somebody a number, you assign somebody a number, you give a child 80 out of 100, you have given a value to his work. You are weighed in the balances. Weighing somebody is assessing the person. It's giving a value to the person, right? If I am weighed, I might weigh, I won't tell you how much, but if I weigh 120, 130, whatever I weigh, it's an assessment. It's an analysis of my physical structure. If you weigh somebody spiritually, you're analyzing their spiritual structure. That's what God is saying. And God numbered Babylon. God weighed Babylon, or we could say that the heavenly watchers, and the consequence was the kingdom was taken away. It was divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So this is a very important chapter in that it teaches us. It teaches us this principle that God is operating on the basis of a judgment. There is a judgment that takes place before each kingdom is overthrown. And later on, we see that this is very important in how we understand what is happening in the book of Daniel and Revelation. So these chapters are not prophetic chapters, but they are full of types and illustrations which are vital for us to understand as we progress in our study of these prophetic books.
Brother David, I
Sure.
think that when the part that says that his kingdom was numbered and finished it, I think that, you know, when like the Bible said your days are numbered, I think is a time that has been set for it to come to an end. I think that's what it actually means. If you look at the context.
Can
He
you,
said that your kingdom is numbered and God has numbered their kingdom and finish it.
do you have some kind of any other place where it says somebody's time is numbered? Any other place you can think of in the Bible?
I think so. I'll give it to you in a while.
All right, because I would be interested, because I don't think we'll find that any other place. But my thought is that people develop the phrase, your days are numbered. And I think where they got it from is from Belshazzar's story. I think when somebody says your days are numbered, it's a more modern phrase. I don't think it's a Bible phrase.
It came from
If you can
David
show me,
said it.
I will stand to be corrected.
David said it. He says number. He said, teach me to number my days.
Yes, yes. But it's not the same thing, because he's saying, teach me to count my days in such a way that I may apply my heart to wisdom. It doesn't mean that his life is coming to an end.
So why is he numbering his days? Why is he counting his days for?
Because he wants to use
He's taking to stock the time he has to live.
no, he wants to use his days wisely. He's talking about keeping a sensible account of how I spend my time. That during that time I apply my heart to wisdom. It's like you say somebody is wasting his time. David is saying the opposite thing. Teach me not to waste my time. Right? To take account of my life as I'm going along, that I don't waste my time. I use it wisely.
What about Psalm 39:4, where he says, show me, Lord, my life's end and the number of my days?
Again, it's logical, because I would say, I would number my days and I say I've been here for 72 years. It doesn't mean that it's an end to my time. When you say, I mean, numbering is how we measure the progress of time. So it's normal that people always say, use numbers in that connection. But the idea that numbering somebody's days means that you have limited the time in which how long he's going to live. You have set a limit on it. That is what I'm talking about. So when we say your days are numbered, where did that phrase come from? That's the question I'm asking. And I know that this is a fairly modern phrase in my knowledge of the English language. And so if you say your days are numbered,
Brother David,
yes,
it's in Job 2.
all right.
Job says,
Yeah, I was coming to that.
14 verse 5. Somebody speaking? Sorry.
No,
Go ahead,
go
Brother
ahead.
Jude.
I was saying I was coming to that. Yeah.
Job says, a man's days are numbered. You know the number of his months. He cannot live longer than the time you have set. So now look away from him, that he may rest until he has lived the time set for man, like a man paid to work.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, I still think, though, Brother Judah, it's similar to what I said before, because when it says a man's days are numbered, what it is saying is that God knows beforehand how long a person is going to live. God has appointed how long a person is going to live. The idea that God says, I have numbered your kingdom and finished it. That is a sentence of the end. Now, you could say that God was saying, from the moment that Babylon began, I counted how many days Babylon would last, and I've decided to bring it to an end at that time. But remember that what we are looking at here in Daniel is a judgment, a sentence that is based on Belshazzar's behavior. So what God is saying, based on your behavior, based on the judgment I have made, I have decided to put an end to your kingdom, right? So when he says God has numbered your kingdom and finished it, I am associating that with the fact that God is doing what he's doing because he has assessed Daniel's kingdom, Belshazzar's kingdom. So I'm looking at that numbering.
Not challenging you, brother, brother David, but I would say that Job is somewhat consonant with that because it does suggest that God is sovereign over all men and he is the one who sets the limits of
Agreed.
our lives and the limits of kingdom. So that's the only wise I was saying that because I thought you were asking if this concept has been used before, and that I'm rendering this as an instance of it being used.
Okay, right. Now, there's a little distinction that I want to make. I want to be understood so that it doesn't look like I'm nitpicking. And the distinction is this: if I say to somebody, "Your days are numbered," I'm not glorifying God, and I'm not making the point that God knows everything. I'm threatening you. Or I'm not if I'm not threatening you, I'm putting a sentence on you of, I'm saying that you're a bad person, and I'm saying because of this, there's a decision to end your days. That's what the phrase normally uses, means. I don't know if anybody has viewed it otherwise, but if I say to somebody, your days are numbered, right? It's almost a threat. So it's different from saying God has determined beforehand how long a person may live. Because in that sense, my days are numbered. In that sense, your days are numbered. Nina's days are numbered. Sister Helena, and all of us, our days are numbered in that sense. God has predetermined how long we are going to live. But when a person says your days are numbered, in that sense, it means that there's a sudden and unexpected end because of displeasure with the way you behave. So there's a little difference. That's what I'm saying. So I hope that distinction in what I'm saying is understood. Okay? So this is why I am reserving the interpretation I give, because in the context of what we are looking at in Daniel chapter 5 is a sentence that comes upon Nebuchadnezzar, upon Belshazzar. A sentence comes upon Belshazzar because of his behavior. So that's why I think that the numbering there are two ways to look at it. But I think that the implication that it means that God has given a value to your kingdom and decided to end it, is at least a part of what is being said there. Go ahead, Judah.
Not to prolong the point, but we see the same principle in Proverbs 10:27, where it says, the fear of the Lord adds length to life, but the years of the wicked are cut short. I imagine that would be more consonant with what you're saying in terms of what is happening, that because of behavior, one's length, and it lends another question. I mean, just Thursday I was having a discussion with an older gentleman who was taken to putting out these things to me because he knows I have a biblical worldview. So we are in a perennial discourse. So he was using the example of Trump and how he, despite what he's doing, he survived the suicide attempt, while the people in Palestine are dying. And he suggests that there's no end there's no seeming end for wicked people on this earth. We were actually on, and I'm coming to a close, we're actually on an old plantation here in Antigua. And the persons who have succeeded, who now own the property, are direct lineal descendants of those who perished. While on the other hand, many of the slaves are all over the country in unmarked graves. He was making the commentary that, oh, we talk about God and religion and what have you, but the wicked seem to be living on endlessly long lives. They live happily ever after. Well, of course, I know the answer, but I mean, here it is in this particular case, the instance of Belshazzar. We have a stark example, as you say, his behavior resulting in judgment being meted out to him, but we don't necessarily see that happening in recent times, do we? Does it have to do with the new covenant? That's where I'm going to. I'm posing that question.
Sure. Yeah, once we understand the covenants, it becomes easier to understand. The time of the old covenant, I was wanting to mention this too in the study, that if you notice, the thing that God emphasizes over and over and over is his power. And even though the entire Bible has a great emphasis on the power of God, in the new covenant, there's far more emphasis on the character of God as a God of love. You don't find that emphasized a lot under the old covenant. And the reason is because God's revelation of himself is unfolding. It's by degrees. It's based on the culture and the times. He's doing things in a structured, timely way. So in the Old Testament, he's focusing on his power, and a part of that power is demonstrating his ability to punish the wicked and to deliver the righteous, and so on. In the Old Testament, the only salvation they had was to live long in the land, was to be delivered from their enemies. That's the only salvation they were promised in most of the discourses that God gave. But in the new covenant, we are not so fixated on, well, I like to live long, but it's not a massive priority, because this is not our home. We know this. They never knew that. We know this. If we get killed here and our names go into obscurity, it matters not, because we know this world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. I mean, one of the things that has been a source of, I fall back on this a lot, because there's vanity in human beings. You know, sometimes I wonder, what if I die and nobody ever knows my name? And what if I labor for the Lord and nobody ever recognizes it? Well, I know that there are about 100 people in this room who might remember me if I die. But I might be, I mean, in terms of this world, they'll remember Donald Trump. They'll remember Starmer in England. They'll remember Andrew Holness in Jamaica. These are the people who will be remembered. People like you and me, who labored in a cause that was worthwhile. And maybe we did something for eternity that is vastly more important than any of these men. In this world, what recognition will you have? Nothing. But we have learned to live for another world. That's the point. You know, we have learned to live for another world. And as you say, Brother Judah, I know you know these things, but it's good to highlight them. We have learned to live for another world, and we know that when we get home, we might be surprised and may not be surprised at the names that are recognized there. And it's best to leave it there, you know. It's best to leave it there. But in this world, I guess the proverb works very well here. Blessed are those who expect nothing for they will not be disappointed. That's a good mantra to live by in this world. All right, but concerning the numbering, I will take a closer look at those references to numbers, and maybe next week we can look at it a little more closely. I promise that I look at it more closely, Brother Ian, and I will see if I can see if what I see will lead me to similar conclusions. But at the moment, this is the way I see it. But thank you, everyone, for your time this evening. We have come to the end of our time, so I'm going to ask you to just join with me in prayer before we bring things to a close.